Every parent knows the crushing weight of watching their children's eyes when there's not enough money for the things that matter most. Álvaro Cruz feels that weight every single day as he works double shifts as a landscaper, barely keeping his late mother's cottage from foreclosure while raising 9-year-old Luna and 12-year-old Diego alone. On this particular Saturday, while Al sweats through another weekend job, his kids are digging in their grandmother's garden when they uncover something impossible. Hidden beneath the old fig tree is a cedar strongbox containing 20 rare gold coins from the 1930s, now worth nearly $20 million. But these aren't just random treasures. The faded journals buried with them reveal their quiet, humble abuela had been carrying a decades-old promise to help families who lost everything during the Spanish Civil War. Now Al faces an impossible choice. He could sell the coins and solve every financial problem his family has ever had. Or he could honor his mother's unfinished mission to return this fortune to the descendants of families who were robbed during wartime. The decision will take them on a journey across 2 continents, where they'll discover that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. What happens when a struggling father must choose between saving his own family and healing the wounds of strangers from the past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small backyard, where Álvaro Cruz knelt beside a struggling rosebush, his weathered hands gentle despite their calluses. At 42, Al carried the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that life's heaviest burdens often came wrapped in the most ordinary moments. The mortgage notice tucked in his back pocket crinkled softly as he shifted, a reminder that this peaceful Saturday morning was borrowed time. "Papa, the coffee's getting cold," Luna called from the kitchen window, her voice carrying the particular mixture of affection and exasperation that only a 9-year-old daughter could master. She had inherited her grandmother's expressive dark eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, though Maria had been gone for 3 years, now taken too soon by cancer that had drained their savings, as surely as it had drained the color from her cheeks. The cottage had been in his family for 2 generations, purchased by his parents when they first arrived from Mexico with dreams bigger than their pockets. His mother, Elena Cruz abuela, to the children, had tended this garden with the devotion of someone who understood that beauty was often the only luxury the poor could afford. Even now, 2 years after her passing, Al could still smell her morning coffee mingling with the scent of jasmine she had planted along the kitchen window. "Coming, mija," Al replied, brushing dirt from his knees as he stood. The house needed painting, the gutters sagged slightly on the east side, and the front steps had developed a troubling wobble. But it was home. More than that, it was the only stability Luna and Diego had ever known. Inside, the kitchen held the comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to make do with less, but had never learned to make do with less love. Diego sat at the small round table, his 12-year-old frame still catching up to his recent growth spurt, bent over a history textbook with the intense focus that had always marked him as different from other kids his age. Where Luna blazed through life with intuitive confidence, Diego approached the world like a puzzle that could be solved if he just gathered enough information. "What are you studying so early on a Saturday?" Al asked, ruffling his son's dark hair as he reached for his coffee muga-chipped ceramic piece that had been Elena's favorite, decorated with faded sunflowers. "The Spanish Civil War," Diego said without looking up. "Mrs. Patterson assigned us to research our family history, and I found some stuff about great-grandfather in one of Abuela's old boxes in the closet." Al paused, the mug halfway to his lips. His mother had kept many things from the old country, most of them stored in cardboard boxes that smelled of mothballs and memory. She had been selective about which stories she shared, always insisting that some chapters of the past were better left closed. "What kind of stuff?" he asked carefully. "Just some old letters and photographs. There's one of him in what looks like a soldier's uniform, but the writing is all in Spanish and I can barely make it out. The ink is really faded." Diego finally looked up, his serious brown eyes holding a curiosity that reminded Al painfully of Elena. "Did you know great grandfather fought in a war?" Luna appeared at Al's elbow, having inherited her mother's ability to materialize silently when interesting conversations began. "Can we see the pictures?" "After breakfast," Al said, deflecting with the practiced ease of a single father who had learned to manage his children's enthusiasm while protecting them from complexities they weren't ready to understand. Elena had been deliberately vague about her father's role in the Spanish Civil War, and Al had respected her silence. Some wounds, she had told him once, were too deep to heal and too dangerous to expose. The morning routine continued with the comfortable rhythm they had developed over the years. Luna helped pack Diego's soccer gear for his game that afternoon, while Al prepared their simple breakfast of eggs and toast. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, its headlines speaking of distant troubles that felt manageable compared to the immediate weight of keeping his small family afloat. At $30 an hour, when he could get steady work, Al's landscaping business kept them housed and fed, but just barely. The medical bills from Maria's illness had destroyed their savings, and the cottage's mortgage had been refinanced twice to keep them current. Mrs. Henderson next door had offered to watch the kids for free when Al worked weekends, a kindness that embarrassed and humbled him in equal measure. "I have to work today," he announced, watching both children's faces fall slightly. Saturday jobs paid time and a half, but they meant missing Diego's soccer game and Luna's friend's birthday party. "Mrs. Henderson said you can help her with her garden if you want." "Or we could work on our own garden," Luna suggested brightly. "Abuela always said the fig tree needed attention, and we never got to finish planting those bulbs she bought." Al's throat tightened. Elena had purchased tulip bulbs the week before her heart attack, planning a spring display that would never bloom. The bulbs still sat in their paper bag in the garage, another small reminder of interrupted dreams. "That's a good idea, mija. Just be careful around the tree roots. They go deeper than you think." The fig tree dominated the center of the backyard, its gnarled branches reaching toward the cottage like protective arms. Elena had always claimed it was the heart of the garden, planted by Al's grandfather when he first bought the house. She would sit beneath it on summer evenings, shelling beans or mending clothes, telling stories about the old country that were equal parts memory and myth. As Al gathered his work tools from the garage, he found himself studying the tree with new attention. Diego's questions about great-grandfather had stirred something uncomfortable, a sense that his family's history contained chapters he had never bothered to read. Elena's reluctance to discuss the past had seemed like protective discretion when he was younger, but now he wondered what she had been protecting them from. The work truck started on the third try, its engine coughing to life with mechanical reluctance that mirrored Al's own feelings about leaving his children on yet another Saturday. Through the kitchen window, he could see Luna and Diego clearing the breakfast dishes with the efficient cooperation they had developed out of necessity. They were good kids, resilient in ways that broke his heart and filled him with pride simultaneously. Mrs. Henderson waved from her own garden as Al backed out of the driveway, her silver hair catching the morning light. At 78, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to husband her energy, but her mind remained sharp and her kindness inexhaustible. She had been Elena's closest friend and had seamlessly stepped into the role of honorary grandmother after Elena's death. The job site was across town in one of the newer developments where prosperity announced itself through perfectly manicured lawns and 3-car garages. Al's client, a pharmaceutical executive named Mr. Winters, wanted his backyard redesigned to include a water feature and raised flower beds, a project that would pay well but require most of the day. As Al unloaded his equipment, he tried to push away the familiar mixture of resentment and gratitude that came with working in wealthy neighborhoods. These people could afford to spend more on landscaping than he made in 2 months, but their money kept his family housed. It was a transaction he understood, even if he didn't entirely like it. The morning passed in the meditative rhythm of physical labor. Al had always found comfort in working with his hands, in the straightforward honesty of plants that grew when tended properly and died when neglected. Unlike the complex emotional landscape of raising children alone, or the Byzantine requirements of insurance companies and mortgage lenders, gardens responded to care with predictable gratitude. By noon, the sun had grown hot enough to make him grateful for the wide-brimmed hat Elena had given him years ago. The water feature was taking shape, its gentle curves designed to create the illusion of a natural stream. Winters had approved the design with the casual confidence of someone who had never had to choose between paying for groceries or paying for utilities. During his lunch break, Al called home to check on the children, a habit that had developed during the anxious months after Maria's death, when every separation felt potentially permanent. "We're fine, Papa," Diego assured him, his voice carrying the patient tolerance of a child who had grown accustomed to being checked on. "Luna's been digging around the fig tree, like you said. She found some weird old bottles and stuff. Just be careful," Al cautioned. "Some of that old glass might be sharp." In the background, he could hear Luna's voice, breathless with excitement about something she had discovered. The sound filled him with the complicated mixture of joy and anxiety that came with loving people whose happiness you couldn't always protect or provide. The afternoon stretched ahead with the promise of overtime pay and the certainty of tired muscles. As Al returned to work, he carried with him the image of his children safe in their grandmother's garden, surrounded by the familiar walls of the only home they had ever known. It was a fragile piece, built on borrowed time and held together by hope, but it was theirs. He had no way of knowing that 20 feet underground, beneath the protective canopy of Elena's beloved fig tree, his children were about to uncover a secret that would transform their understanding of family, sacrifice, and the true meaning of treasure. The past Elena had worked so carefully to bury was about to bloom in ways she had never intended, carrying with it the power to either save her family or destroy everything they thought they knew about who they were. Al's truck wheezed to a stop in the driveway just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the neighbor's oak trees. His shoulders ached from 8 hours of moving stone and soil, but the envelope in his shirt pocket felt heavier than any physical burden. Mr. Winters had paid in cash, as promised, but it would barely cover next month's mortgage payment. The arithmetic of survival had become a constant calculation that never quite balanced. The house seemed unusually quiet as he approached the front door. Normally, Luna would have bounded out to greet him, full of stories about her day and demands for his attention. Instead, he found both children sitting on the living room couch, their faces wearing matching expressions of barely contained excitement and uncertainty. "Papa," Diego said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he wasn't sure whether he was in trouble. "We need to show you something." Luna bounced slightly on the couch cushions, her dark eyes wide with the kind of discovery that changed everything. "It's really, really important," she added, though her attempt at seriousness was undermined by the fact that she was practically vibrating with anticipation. Al noticed the dirt under their fingernails first, then the small pile of aged items arranged carefully on the coffee table like artifacts in a museum display. There was a tarnished silver locket, several leather-bound notebooks with cracked covers, and what appeared to be a small canvas bag tied with faded ribbon. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into his worn armchair and feeling the familiar creak of springs that had been protesting for years. "We were working in the garden, like you said," Diego began, his natural tendency toward methodical explanation taking over. Luna was digging around the base of the fig tree, where abuela always said the soil was richest, and she hit something hard with the spade. Luna couldn't contain herself any longer. "It was a box, Papa. A really old wooden box, buried deep under the roots. It took us forever to dig it out, and Mrs. Henderson had to help us carry it because it was so heavy." Al felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. Elena had been very specific about the fig tree over the years, often mentioning that its roots ran deep and that certain areas around its base should be left undisturbed. He had always assumed she was protecting the tree's health, but now he wondered if she had been protecting something else entirely. "Show me," he said quietly. Diego reached for the canvas bag first, handling it with the reverence of someone who understood they were touching history. "There are coins in here, Papa. Really old ones. We looked them up online at Mrs. Henderson's house, and they're from Spain, from the 1930s. Al's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the bag. The canvas felt soft with age, and the ribbon that secured it had once been red, but had faded to the color of dried roses. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had the texture of old silk, were 20 gold coins that caught the afternoon light and threw it back with surprising brilliance. Each coin bore the profile of a young woman and Spanish text that Al's high school language classes weren't adequate to fully translate. But he recognized the dates 1931, 1932, 1933 years that he knew from Elena's careful silences had been significant in his family's history. "The computer said they might be worth a lot of money," Luna said softly, as if speaking too loudly might make the coins disappear. Like a really lot of money. But it was the notebooks that made Al's breath catch in his throat. The leather covers bore his mother's initials EC, but the handwriting inside was not hers. The pages were filled with careful script in Spanish, interspersed with pressed flowers, sketches of gardens, and what appeared to be lists of names and addresses. Diego had been busy with his research. "I think they belonged to great-grandfather," he said, producing a magnifying glass that Mrs. Henderson had loaned them. "Look at this page. The writing talks about the responsibility and the families who trusted us, and there are addresses in Spain." Al turned the delicate pages carefully, his limited Spanish allowing him to catch fragments of meaning. Words like refugiados and promesas appeared repeatedly, along with references to children and families whose names meant nothing to him, but had clearly meant everything to whoever had written these careful records. The silver locket was the most personal item. When Al opened it with fumbling fingers, he found a faded photograph of 3 children boys and a girl standing in front of what appeared to be a stone building. Their clothes were simple but clean, and their expressions held the guarded hopefulness of children who had learned not to expect too much from life. But it was the inside of the locket that made Diego lean forward with excitement. Etched into the silver in tiny, precise letters was a series of numbers and symbols that looked like a code. "Mrs. Henderson thinks it might be a map reference or coordinates," Diego explained. "She said her late husband used to use codes like this in the Navy." Al studied the markings, feeling the weight of secrets his mother had carried to her grave. Elena had always been a woman of careful words and deliberate silences, but he had never imagined that her quietness concealed something of this magnitude. "There's more," Luna said, producing what appeared to be a letter written on different paper from the journal entries. The handwriting was Elena's, and it was addressed to him. "Mijo," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the children have found what I could never bring myself to show you. These coins were never ours to keep, though your grandfather carried them with love and the best intentions. They represent a promise made to families who lost everything, and a responsibility that I was too afraid to fulfill. Perhaps you and the children will have the courage that I lacked." Al's throat constricted as he read his mother's confession. She wrote of her father's involvement in helping Spanish Civil War refugees, of his role in safeguarding valuables for families who hoped to reclaim them after the war ended. But the war had scattered those families across continents, and her father had died with the knowledge of how to find them. "I tried to research the names in the journals," Elena's letter continued, "but the task seemed impossible, and I convinced myself that keeping the coins safe was enough. I was wrong. These treasures were meant to heal wounds, not to sit buried in our garden. The locket contains the key to finding the families. Your children have braver hearts than mine. Trust their instincts." The letter was signed with a shaky version of Elena's signature, dated just 3 months before her death. Luna had moved closer to Al's chair and was now leaning against his arm, her small hand resting on his forearm. "Papa, are we rich now?" The question hung in the air between innocence and complexity. Al looked at his children Diego with his serious expression and careful notes. Luna, with her intuitive understanding that something profound had shifted in their small world and felt the weight of a choice that would define not just their future, but their understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. "I don't know, Mija," he said honestly. "I don't know what we are now." Outside, the fig tree's branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, its roots now exposed where the children had carefully excavated around the buried strongbox. Mrs. Henderson had helped them replace the soil, but the garden would never look quite the same. Some secrets, once unearthed, changed the landscape forever. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Al held his children close and studied the artifacts spread before them, coins that might be worth a fortune, journals that spoke of promises unfulfilled, and a locket that held the key to a mystery spanning decades. For the first time in years, the mortgage notice in his pocket seemed like the least of his worries. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that made difficult decisions feel temporarily manageable. Al had spent most of the night at the kitchen table, carefully examining each item from the strongbox while his children slept. The Spanish Republican currency that had been tucked beneath the gold coins told its own story, worthless paper money from a government that had fallen, dreams rendered valueless by history's harsh arithmetic. The bills were crisp despite their age, suggesting they had been carefully preserved by someone who believed they might one day hold meaning again. Each note bore the hopeful imagery of a republic that had promised equality and justice, now reduced to historical curiosities that spoke of interrupted dreams. Diego appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair sticking up at improbable angles, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sight of his father, surrounded by papers and artifacts. "Did you sleep at all?" Diego asked, sliding into the chair across from Al with the direct concern of a child who had learned to read his parents' emotional weather. "Some," Alid, though the truth was that he had dozed fitfully in the chair, his dreams filled with images of Spanish villages and families he had never met but somehow felt responsible for helping. Luna's arrival was announced by the sound of her feet hitting the floor in the room above, followed by the rapid patter of her descent down the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Are we going to be detectives?" she asked without preamble, settling onto Al's lap and studying the materials spread across the table with the intense focus she usually reserved for puzzles and art projects. "I think we might have to be," Al admitted, finding comfort in her warm weight against his chest. "Your great-grandfather left us quite a mystery." The phone rang at 8:30, earlier than Al's clients usually called on weekends. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a mixture of excitement and concern that had clearly kept her awake as well. "Al, dear, I hope you don't mind, but I did some research of my own last night. Those coins of yours, they're quite remarkable. My neighbor's son is a numismatist, and I showed him the photographs Diego took. He thinks they could be worth considerably more than we initially estimated." Al felt his stomach tighten. "How much more?" "Perhaps as much as $1 million each, if they're authentic. The Spanish Republic minted very few gold coins, and most were melted down during the war. These could be some of the only surviving examples." $20 million. The number felt too large to have meaning, like trying to comprehend the distance to stars. Al looked at his children, who had stopped their morning routine to listen to his half of the conversation, their expressions shifting from excitement to something approaching awe. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson continued. "The young man I spoke with mentioned that there are collectors and dealers who specialize in Spanish Civil War artifacts. Some of them have, shall we say, questionable ethics. Word about discoveries like this has a way of spreading quickly." After ending the call, Al found himself staring at the coins with new eyes. What had seemed like a family mystery the night before now felt like a burden that could easily become dangerous. Stories of treasure hunters and unscrupulous collectors were the stuff of adventure novels, not the quiet reality of a landscaper trying to raise his children in suburban peace. "Papa," Diego said carefully, "what are we going to do?" It was the question Al had been avoiding, though he knew it was inevitable. The responsible choice would be to contact a reputable auction house, authenticate the coins, and sell them for whatever they would bring. $20 million would solve every problem they had ever faced and provide security for generations. But Elena's letter haunted him. The careful records in the journals spoke of families who had trusted his grandfather with their most precious possessions, believing they would be returned when safety was restored. Those families had names and histories, children and grandchildren who might still be searching for traces of their scattered heritage. I think we need to understand what we're really dealing with first, Al said slowly. These coins weren't meant to be treasure. They were meant to be returned to people who lost everything. Luna nodded solemnly, her intuitive understanding of right and wrong cutting through the complexity with characteristic directness. Like when someone loses their wallet and you try to find them to give it back. Exactly like that, Mija, except this wallet has been lost for almost 90 years. The morning was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the front door. Through the window, Al could see a well-dressed man in his 50s holding a business card and wearing the kind of confident smile that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Cruz? My name is Richard Blackwood, and I represent several private collectors who specialize in historical artifacts. I understand you may have come into possession of some items that could be of interest to my clients." Al felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How did you hear about that?" Blackwood's smile never wavered. "Word travels quickly in the numismatic community. I'd like to discuss a private sale that could be very beneficial for everyone involved. No auctions, no publicity, no complications, just a simple transaction that could set your family up for life." Behind Al, Diego and Luna had moved closer to the door, their instinctive wariness matching his own. There was something in Blackwood's manner that suggested his offer was less generous than it appeared, and his timing seemed suspiciously convenient. "I'm not ready to sell anything," Al said firmly. "We're still trying to understand what we have." Of course, but you should know that items like these can attract unwanted attention if word spreads. There are people who might be less civilized in their approach to acquisition. My clients prefer discreet arrangements that protect everyone's interests." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. Al felt Diego's hand slip into his, a gesture of solidarity that strengthened his resolve. "I appreciate your concern," Al said, "but we're not interested in selling at this time." Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, the practiced charm giving way to something harder. "I hope you'll reconsider, Mr. Cruz. These kinds of opportunities don't remain private indefinitely." After closing the door, Al turned to find his children watching him with expressions that mixed pride and concern. They had heard the subtle menace in Blackwood's words, and their trust in their father's ability to protect them was both humbling and terrifying. "That man was scary," Luna said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "He was," Al agreed. "Which means we need to be very careful about how we handle this. But we don't make decisions based on fear, do we?" Diego shook his head firmly. "Abuela always said that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing." The rest of the morning passed in a strange mixture of normal routine and extraordinary planning. Al made pancakes, while Luna and Diego sorted through the journals, looking for clues that might help them understand their great-grandfather's intentions. The worthless Spanish Republican currency served as bookmarks, each bill a reminder of dreams that had been interrupted, but not necessarily destroyed. By noon, they had made a decision that would change everything. They would try to find the families mentioned in the journals, starting with the code in the locket that Mrs. Henderson believed might be coordinates. It was a choice that prioritized purpose over profit, legacy over immediate gratification. "Are we really going to give away $20 million? Diego asked, his natural pragmatism warring with his sense of justice. "We're going to try to find out if it was ever really ours to keep," Al replied, pulling both children close. "Sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit isn't money. It's the chance to finish something important that someone else started." Outside, the fig tree stood sentinel over their disturbed garden, its roots no longer holding secrets, but its branches still offering shade and shelter. The treasure had been unearthed, but the real journey was just beginning. Monday brought both revelation and complication. Al had taken the day off from worker luxury he couldn't afford, but a necessity he couldn't avoid to accompany Mrs. Henderson to the local university's history department. Professor Maria Santos, a specialist in Spanish Civil War refugee studies, had agreed to examine the journals and help decode the locket's mysterious markings. The university library felt like a sanctuary, its high windows filtering afternoon light across tables where students bent over textbooks and laptops. Professor Santos, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, handled the artifacts with the reverence of someone who understood their historical significance. "These are remarkable," she said softly, photographing each page of the journals with careful precision. "Your great-grandfather appears to have been part of an informal network that helped Republican families safeguard their valuables during the war. Many families buried their treasures or entrusted them to friends, hoping to reclaim them when the conflict ended." Diego leaned forward, his notebook ready to capture every detail. "But the war ended in 1939. Why weren't the treasures returned?" Professor Santos's expression grew somber. "Because many of the families never survived to reclaim them. Others were scattered across the globe as refugees. The network that had promised to reunite families with their possessions was itself destroyed by the war's aftermath." She had been studying the hand-drawn map fragment that Al's children had discovered, tucked between the journal pages. The partial sketch showed locations across Spain, marked with symbols that seemed to correspond to entries in the written records. "These symbols," she said, pointing to small marks next to several Spanish town names, "I believe they indicate places where other caches might have been hidden. Your great-grandfather wasn't just safeguarding one family's treasure, he was part of a much larger preservation effort." Luna, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Professor, what happened to the children in the photograph?" The locket lay open on the table, revealing the faded image of 3 young faces. Professor Santos studied it carefully, then cross-referenced it with the journal entries. "Based on the dates and the location references, I believe these children were residents of an orphanage in Salamanca that served Republican refugees. The building was destroyed in 1937, but some records survive. With some research, we might be able to identify them or their descendants." The code etched inside the locket had yielded its secrets under Professor Santos's expertise. The numbers were indeed coordinates, pointing to a location in northern Spain, while the symbols appeared to be references to specific entries in a master ledger that might still exist in Spanish archives. "Mr. Cruz," Professor Santos said, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering life-changing news, "I believe your family has inherited not just a treasure, but a mission. These coins represent dozens of families whose stories were interrupted by war. Finding their descendants could be one of the most significant restitution efforts in modern Spanish history." On the drive home, Al's mind raced with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. The professor had offered to help with the research, to connect them with genealogists and historians in Spain who specialized in tracing refugee families. But she had also warned them that their discovery would inevitably attract attention from less altruistic quarters. "Papa," Diego said from the back seat, "how would we even get to Spain? I mean, if we wanted to find those families." It was a practical question that highlighted the gap between noble intentions and financial reality. Al's landscaping business barely covered their monthly expenses, and international travel was as foreign to their budget as luxury cars or private schools. "I don't know, Mijo, but maybe we don't need to solve every problem at once. Maybe we start by learning everything we can from here." Luna had been unusually quiet during the university visit, but her silence had been the focused quiet of someone processing important information. "The lady professor said some of those families might still be looking for their stuff, right? Like their grandchildren and great-grandchildren?" "That's right. Then they've been waiting a really long time. We should probably hurry." That evening, their quiet research was interrupted by another unexpected visitor. This time, the knock came at the back door, and the caller was a middle-aged Latina woman with graying hair and nervous eyes. "Señor Cruz, my name is Carmen Delgado. I heard about your discovery from my cousin who works at the university. I think one of those names in your grandmother's journals might be my grandfather." Al invited her in, studying her face for signs of deception, but finding only the anxious hope of someone who had been searching for answers her entire life. Carmen settled at the kitchen table where the journals lay open, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to an entry dated September 1936. "There," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miguel Delgado, age 47, watchmaker from Salamanca. That's him. That's my grandfather." The journal entry was brief but detailed. Monsieur Delgado entrusted gold watch, family photographs, and small emerald ring belonging to deceased wife. Promised safe return when circumstances permit. Children: Maria, 14, Carlos, 11, Isabelle, 8. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes. Isabelle was my grandmother. She used to tell me stories about the watch. It had belonged to her father's father and had an inscription inside from her mother. She said they had to leave it behind when they fled to Mexico, that someone promised to keep it safe. The weight of connection settled over the kitchen like a presence. This wasn't theoretical history anymore. It was Carmen's family story, interrupted by war and loss, but somehow preserved in Elena's careful records. "Do you know what happened to the watch?" Al asked gently. Carmen shook her head. "My grandmother spent her whole life wondering. She died 5 years ago, still hoping someone might find it. She kept saying that the watch wasn't valuable except to our family, but it was proof that we had existed, that we had mattered." Diego had been taking notes throughout the conversation, his young mind grappling with the realization that history wasn't just something that happened to other people in textbooks. "How did you find out about us?" "My cousin works in the university library. She heard Professor Santos talking about your family's discovery and remembered that I had been researching Spanish Civil War refugees. When she described the journals and the names, she thought I should know." The evening stretched late as Carmen shared what she knew about her family's journey from Spain to Mexico, the hardships of starting over with nothing, and her grandmother's quiet grief for the life and possessions they had left behind. In return, Al showed her the relevant journal entries, the careful records that proved her family's story had not been forgotten. "There might be others," Carmen said as she prepared to leave. "In the Mexican immigrant community, many families have stories like mine. Grandparents who spoke of treasures left behind, promises that were never fulfilled." After she left, Al sat with his children in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by artifacts that were beginning to feel less like treasure and more like sacred trust. The hand-drawn map fragment lay before them, its partial revelations, promising answers that would require courage to pursue. "Papa," Luna said sleepily, curled against his side, "I think abuela knew we would find the box. I think she wanted us to." "Why do you think that?" "Because she always said the fig tree was the heart of the garden. Hearts are supposed to beat, right? Maybe she knew that someday the tree's heart would start beating again." Al looked out the window at the silhouette of the fig tree against the star-filled sky, its branches reaching toward possibilities he was only beginning to understand. The mortgage notice was still in his pocket, the bills were still due, and his family's future was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like hope rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more visitors, and difficult decisions about how to honor both his family's needs and his great-grandfather's unfulfilled promises. But tonight, surrounded by his children and the weight of history, Al felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death. The sense that they were part of something larger than their own struggles, something that might just be worth the risk. 3 weeks later, Al found himself standing in the arrivals terminal of Madrid's Barajas airport, holding Luna's hand while Diego managed their single carry-on bag with the careful responsibility of someone who understood they were carrying irreplaceable documents. The passenger ship manifest from 1939 that Professor Santos had helped them locate was tucked safely in Diego's backpack, along with copies of the journal entries and detailed photographs of the coins. The decision to travel to Spain had been made possible by an unexpected alliance. Carmen Delgado had connected them with a network of Spanish Civil War descendant organizations, both in Mexico and Spain, who had pooled resources to support their research mission. A crowdfunding campaign had raised enough money for basic travel expenses, while Spanish historians had offered volunteer research assistance and places to stay. "It feels different here," Luna observed as they walked through the airport, her dark eyes taking in the rapid flow of Spanish conversations around them. "Like the air remembers things." Al understood what she meant. There was something in the landscape visible through the terminal windows, in the ancient stones and weathered architecture, that spoke of layers of history his American eyes weren't trained to read. This was the country his great-grandfather had fled, carrying secrets and responsibilities that had been passed down through generations like inherited jewelry. Their first destination was the National Historical Archive in Madrid, where Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher specializing in Civil War refugee documentation, had agreed to help them trace the families mentioned in the journals. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent years helping people reconnect with lost pieces of their past. "The records are fragmented," she explained as they settled into the archive's quiet research room. "But we have passenger manifests, refugee registration documents, and some correspondence from aid organizations. Your great-grandfather's journals provide names and details that could help us bridge gaps in the official documentation." The passenger ship manifest they had brought from America proved to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. The document listed 847 Spanish refugees who had boarded the steamship Mexique in Bordeaux, France, bound for Veracruz, Mexico, in March 1939. Among the names were several that matched entries in Al's great-grandfather's careful records. Diego spread the manifest across the research table, his finger tracing down columns of names with the focused intensity that had become his signature approach to complex problems. "Look, Papa, here's Miguel Delgado Carmen's grandfather, but he's listed with only 2 children, not 3. Dr. Vasquez leaned over to examine the entry. "That's not uncommon. Families were often separated during the evacuation, and manifests sometimes reflected only the family members who were together at the time of departure. The 3rd child might have been on a different ship or taken a different route to safety." Luna had been studying a collection of photographs that Dr. Vasquez had assembled images of refugee camps, ship departures, and families saying goodbye to homeland they might never see again. Her empathy, always close to the surface, was evident in the way she handled each photograph with careful reverence. "These people look scared," she said softly, "but also brave." "That's exactly right," Dr. Vasquez replied. "They were leaving everything they knew to protect their families. Many of them carried very little except hope and the promise that someday they might be able to return, or at least recover some connection to the lives they had lost." The afternoon's research yielded concrete progress. They had identified at least 6 families from the journal entries who matched official refugee records. More importantly, Dr. Vasquez had found documentation suggesting that several of these families had maintained contact with refugee support organizations for decades, leaving paper trails that might lead to surviving descendants. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez said, producing a folder that contained what appeared to be organizational correspondence from the 1940s. "Your great-grandfather wasn't acting alone. These letters reference a Committee for the Preservation of Republican Heritage that operated both in Spain and in exile communities. They were systematically documenting and safeguarding cultural and family treasures that might otherwise have been lost." The committee's correspondence revealed the scope of an operation that had been far more organized than Al had imagined. His great-grandfather had been part of a network that included museum curators, university professors, and community leaders who had recognized that war doesn't just destroy lives, it destroys memory, culture, and the physical objects that connect generations. Many of the committee members died during or shortly after the war, Dr. Vasquez continued, but some of their records survived. There might be other caches of preserved items, other families still waiting for treasures that were promised to be kept safe. That evening, in their modest hotel near the Prado Museum, Al sat with his children on the small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street where evening pedestrians moved with the relaxed pace of people who lived among history rather than visiting it. The weight of their discovery was beginning to feel less like burden and more like privilege. "Papa," Diego said, looking up from the notebook where he had been organizing the day's findings, "I think I understand why abuela never told you about this. It wasn't just keeping a secret, it was protecting you from having to choose between helping strangers and taking care of your own family." Al nodded, feeling a deep appreciation for his son's growing wisdom. "And now we have to make that choice. Except it doesn't feel like a choice anymore," Luna added, settling against Al's side with the trust of a child who had never doubted that her father would find the right path. "It feels like we're supposed to be here doing this, like abuela and great-grandfather are helping us figure it out." The next morning brought their first meeting with a living connection to the past. Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 70s who lived in a small apartment near the Retiro Park, was the granddaughter of one of the families mentioned in the journals. Dr. Vasquez had located her through the refugee descendant network, and she had agreed to meet with the Cruz family. Rosa's apartment was filled with photographs, documents, and artifacts that spoke of a family's determination to maintain connections across time and distance. She served coffee and pastries while sharing stories that brought the journal entries to life. "My grandmother talked about the golden crucifix until the day she died," Rosa said, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of decades of wondering. It had been blessed by her parish priest before the war began, and she believed it would protect the family, even if they couldn't carry it with them. The journal entry for Rosa's family was detailed. Ana Martinez, widow, age 40, mother of 3. Entrusted golden crucifix with rubies, family Bible dated 1847, and silver christening cup. Promised return when safe passage possible. She used to say that the crucifix wasn't valuable because of the gold or the rubies, Rosa continued, but because it represented her faith that God would reunite our family someday, somehow. When she died, she made me promise to keep looking for any trace of it. Luna had been studying a photograph of Rosa's grandmother, a serious-looking woman holding a small child. "She looks like someone who kept promises." "She was," Rosa replied, smiling at Luna's intuition. "And now, somehow, a promise made to her is finally being kept." The meeting with Rosa transformed their mission from abstract historical research into immediate human connection. This wasn't about returning valuable objects to their rightful owners, it was about healing wounds that had been carried across generations, about proving that the promises made in desperate times had been honored by strangers who became guardians of memory. "Rosa," Al said carefully, "we haven't found your grandmother's crucifix yet, but we're committed to looking. If it exists in another cache, if it's documented in the committee's records, we'll find it." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Finding it would be wonderful," she said, "but you've already given me something precious. You've proven that my grandmother's story was true, that the people she trusted weren't just kind strangers, but guardians who kept their word across decades." As they prepared to leave Rosa's apartment, she pressed a small wrapped package into Luna's hands. "This belonged to my grandmother. I want you to have it for your journey." Inside the package was a simple wooden cross, worn smooth by generations of handling. It wasn't valuable in any material sense, but it carried the weight of faith and perseverance that had sustained families through unimaginable hardship. That afternoon, walking through Madrid's historic neighborhoods, Al felt the presence of his great-grandfather and Elena in ways that transcended memory. They were no longer just carrying out a family obligation, they were participating in a story that connected past and present, loss and redemption, individual choice, and collective healing. "Tomorrow we go to Salamanca," Diego said, consulting the itinerary they had planned with Dr. Vasquez's help, "to see the place where the orphanage used to be. And maybe," Luna added, clutching Rosa's wooden cross, "to find out what happened to the children in the locket." The Spanish sun was setting behind the city's ancient buildings, casting shadows that seemed to reach across time. Somewhere in this landscape were more families like Rosa's, more stories waiting to be completed. The passenger ship manifest in Diego's backpack contained dozens of names, each representing a life interrupted but not forgotten. Al pulled his children closer as they walked, understanding finally that their inheritance wasn't the gold coin sit, was the opportunity to be part of something larger than themselves, to prove that promises made in love and desperation could be honored across generations. The real treasure wasn't buried in their grandmother's garden. It was walking beside him in the form of two children who had inherited courage along with curiosity, compassion, along with the responsibility to use both wisely. The train to Salamanca carried them through countryside that seemed to hold memory in its stone walls and ancient olive groves. Diego pressed his face to the window, watching small villages pass like pages in a history book, while Luna dozed against Al's shoulder, still clutching Rosa's wooden cross. Al found himself thinking about Elena's silences, understanding now that they hadn't been born from shame or fear, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility. How do you explain to a child that their family carries the grief and hope of strangers? How do you prepare someone for the choice between personal security and moral obligation? The elderly conductor, who checked their tickets, spoke with them briefly in careful English, learning about their mission with the kind of respectful interest that seemed characteristically Spanish. "Salamanca is a city that remembers," he said simply. "You will find what you're looking for there." Salamanca revealed itself like a golden dream rising from the Castilian plateau. The sandstone buildings glowed in the afternoon light, and the ancient university towers spoke of centuries of learning and preservation. Dr. Carmen Herrera, a local historian who specialized in Civil War-era Salamanca, met them at the station with the warm efficiency of someone who had spent years helping families reconnect with their interrupted past. The orphanage was located in what is now the Plaza del Corrillo district, she explained, as their taxi navigated the narrow medieval streets. The building was destroyed in 1937, but we've identified several survivors and have maintained records of the children who lived there. Their destination was a small community center that occupied the exact location where the Santa Teresa orphanage had once housed refugee children. The modern building was simple but well-maintained, with a garden where older residents played chess and children from the neighborhood gathered after school. The center's director, Miguel Santos, was a man in his 60s, whose grandfather had been one of the orphanage's last caretakers. He greeted them with the grave courtesy of someone who understood they were witnessing the completion of a story that had been decades in the making. "We have been expecting you," he said, leading them into a small meeting room where several elderly residents waited. "Dr. Herrera contacted our oral history group when she learned of your research. 3 of our members lived in the orphanage as children. The first survivor they met was Pilar Ramirez, 84 years old, with bright eyes and hands that moved expressively as she spoke. When Al showed her the photograph from the locket, her reaction was immediate and emotional. "That's Isabelle, Carlos, and little Miguel," she said, her voice trembling with recognition. "The Moreno children. They arrived in the spring of 1936 with nothing but the clothes they wore. Their parents had been killed in the early fighting, and they had walked for days to reach us." Luna moved closer to Pilar, her natural empathy drawing her toward the elderly woman's remembered pain. "What happened to them?" Isabelle was the oldest. She must have been 12 in that photograph. She took care of her younger brothers like a little mother. "When the bombing started getting closer to the city, we had to evacuate the children in small groups. The 3 of them were sent to different families, hoping it would be safer." Diego had his notebook ready, documenting every detail with the thoroughness that had become essential to their mission. Do you know where they went? Pilar exchanged glances with the other survivors before answering. We tried to keep records, but everything was chaos. Isabelle went to a family in Barcelona who had offered to take older children. The boys went to relatives in Galicia. We hoped they would be reunited after the war. But the second survivor, Fernando Garcia, was 91 and spoke with the deliberate clarity of someone who had spent years ensuring that important stories weren't forgotten. The war scattered families like seeds in the wind. Some took root in new places, others were lost forever. The Moreno children were just 3 among thousands. But it was the third survivor who provided the breakthrough they hadn't dared hope for. Ana Delgadillo, relation to Carmen from their hometown, was 87 and had maintained contact with refugee networks across Spain for decades. I kept letters, she said simply, producing a wooden box filled with correspondence that spanned 50 years. When children were separated, I tried to help families find each other. I have a letter here from Isabelle Moreno, written in 1952. The letter was brief, but contained crucial information. Isabelle had married and was living in Barcelona under the name Isabelle Moreno de Vega. She had spent years searching for her brothers, and had last heard that Carlos had emigrated to Argentina in 1948. Miguel, the youngest, had died of tuberculosis in 1943. She stopped writing after 1955, Ana continued, but I kept her address. Her daughter might still live there. Dr. Herrera had been making notes throughout the conversation. I can contact the civil registry in Barcelona. If Isabelle married and had children there, we should be able to trace her family. As the afternoon light slanted through the community center's windows, Miguel Santos led them to the garden where a cornerstone from the original orphanage had been preserved as a memorial. The stone bore a simple inscription, "In memory of the children who found shelter here, and in hope of their reunion with love." But it was what Miguel revealed next that transformed their understanding of their mission entirely. Hidden within a hollow space in the cornerstone was a sealed metal container that had been placed there in 1940 by the orphanage's staff. "We discovered this during the renovation 5 years ago," Miguel explained, carefully removing the container. "We've been waiting for the right time, the right people to open it." Inside the container was a collection of letters written by the orphanage children in 1940, each one addressed to the people who will help us someday. The letters were childish in their handwriting, but profound in their hope and gratitude. One letter, signed by Isabelle, Carlos, and Miguel Moreno, brought tears to Al's eyes. "To the kind people who will read this someday, we are writing this letter so you will know that we existed and that we were loved. Our mama and papa died in the war, but the people here take care of us. Someone told us that there are people keeping our things safe until we can have them back. We want to say thank you, even though we don't know your names. When we grow up and have children, we will tell them about the people who remembered us. Love, Isabelle, Carlos, and Miguel." Luna wiped tears from her cheeks. They knew someone would come, didn't they? They knew people like great-grandfather were keeping promises. The evening brought a quiet dinner at the community center, where the survivors shared more stories of the orphanage and the networks of people who had worked to maintain connections across the chaos of war and its aftermath. Al began to understand that his great-grandfather had been part of something much larger, a web of ordinary people who had made extraordinary commitments to preserve not just objects, but hope itself. "There's something else you should know," Miguel Santos said as they prepared to leave. "This community center is struggling financially. We serve 40 families in this neighborhood, providing childcare, elder care, and educational programs. But our funding was cut last year, and we may have to close." Dr. Herrera nodded sadly. "It's happening throughout Spain. These small community programs that serve the most vulnerable populations are often the first to lose support." That night, in their small hotel room, Al sat with his children and the orphanage cornerstone letter, trying to process the weight of everything they had learned. The trail to Isabelle's family was promising, but the discovery of the community center's financial crisis had added a new dimension to their mission. "Papa," Diego said thoughtfully, "what if the coins aren't just supposed to go to individual families? What if they're supposed to help places like the community center too?" Luna nodded enthusiastically. "The orphanage took care of kids who didn't have families. The community center does the same thing now. Maybe that's part of what great-grandfather wanted, to help places that help people." Al looked at his children, marveling at their ability to see connections that adults often missed. The gold coins represented enormous wealth, but they were beginning to understand that the true value lay not in what the money could buy for their own family, but in what it could heal for everyone whose lives had been touched by the interrupted promises of the past. "Tomorrow, we try to find Isabelle's daughter in Barcelona," Al said, pulling them close. "And then we figure out how to honor both the individual families and the places that served as families when blood relatives were lost." Outside their window, Salamanca's ancient stones held the light of street lamps like memories holding space for hope. Somewhere in Barcelona, Isabelle Moreno de Vega's descendants might be waiting for news they had never dared expect. And here in this golden city, a community center sat on the exact spot where children had once written letters to strangers who would someday remember them. The orphanage cornerstone letter lay on the bedside table, its childish handwriting a testament to faith that had been justified across decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more families to find, and difficult decisions about how to distribute not just wealth, but healing. But tonight, surrounded by the weight of promises being kept, Al felt the presence of his great-grandfather and Elena like a blessing, guiding them toward choices that would honor both the past and the future. The call came at dawn, jarring Al from restless sleep in their Barcelona hotel room. Dr. Herrera's voice carried urgency mixed with excitement, and her news would change everything they thought they understood about their mission. "We found her," Dr. Herrera said without preamble. "Isabelle Moreno de Vega. She's alive, Al. She's 89 years old and living in a care facility here in Barcelona. But there's something else, something you need to know before you meet her." Al sat up carefully, trying not to wake Diego and Luna, who were sharing the room's second bed. "What is it?" "Isabelle has been looking for your family for 60 years. She knew about the coins, knew about your great-grandfather, and she's been waiting for someone from the Cruz family to find her." The words hit Al like a revelation that recontextualized everything they had discovered. This wasn't a case of lost families stumbling upon unexpected restitution. This was a meeting that had been anticipated, planned for, hoped toward across decades of separation. How could she have known? "She has letters, Al. Letters from your great-grandfather that were never sent. Documents that were meant to reach your family but somehow never did. You'll understand when you see them." 2 hours later, they stood outside the Residencia Santa Clara, a modest care facility in Barcelona's Gracia district. The building was clean but weathered, housing elderly residents whose families either couldn't care for them at home or who had no families left to provide care. Isabelle Moreno de Vega was waiting in the facility's small garden, her silver hair carefully arranged, and her dark eyes bright with anticipation that seemed to have been decades in the making. Despite her age, she sat with the straight posture of someone who had never surrendered to time's diminishments. "You have your great-grandfather's eyes," she said to Al in careful English before switching to Spanish for Diego to translate. "I have been waiting so long to meet Elena's family." Luna approached her with the instinctive directness that had served them well throughout their journey. "Are you the little girl in the locket picture?" Isabelle smiled, opening a small purse to retrieve an identical locket-tarnished silver with the same intricate engravings. "I am. And this locket has been waiting to be reunited with its partner for 87 years. When the two lockets were placed side by side, their complementary design became apparent. They were parts of a set designed to interlock in a way that revealed a hidden compartment containing a key and a detailed map. "Your great-grandfather was my cousin, Isabelle explained, her voice carrying the weight of family secrets that had been preserved across generations. Our fathers were brothers who took different paths during the war. My father stayed to fight with the Republicans. Yours fled to Mexico to preserve what could be saved. Diego was furiously taking notes, trying to capture the implications of what they were learning. But why didn't Abuela know this? Why didn't she know you were family? Isabelle's expression grew sad. Because the letters never reached her. Your great-grandfather wrote to her every year until he died, trying to explain the full scope of what he had carried to America. But the postal service between Spain and Mexico was unreliable, especially for correspondence that mentioned the war or family connections that might be politically sensitive. She produced a small wooden box filled with envelopes addressed to Álvaro Cruz in careful handwriting. The letters spanned from 1945 to 1962, a one-sided correspondence that told the story of a man trying to fulfill promises across impossible distance. He wrote about you, Al, Isabelle continued, selecting one of the later letters, about Elena's son, who might someday understand the weight of what the family carried. He hoped that the children or grandchildren would be braver than our generation, willing to take the risks we couldn't take. Al opened the letter with trembling hands. His great-grandfather's Spanish was formal but emotional. Mi querida Elena, the letter began. I grow old wondering if these words will ever reach you, if you will ever understand that the treasures I carried were never meant to be kept by our family alone. Isabelle writes that she is well, but that the Spanish families we promised to help are still scattered, still hoping for reunion with what they lost. The coins are not our inheritance, they are our responsibility. I pray that your children will have the courage I lacked to complete what we began. But it was the final document in Isabelle's collection that contained the most shocking revelation. Hidden in an envelope marked Para la familia Cruz Urgente was a detailed letter written by Elena herself, dated just 3 months before her death. Abuela wrote this? Luna asked, studying the familiar handwriting. Isabelle nodded. She contacted me after finding some of your great-grandfather's papers among her possessions. She realized that she wasn't the only family member carrying secrets, and she wanted to ensure that the full truth would be preserved. Al's hands shook as he read his mother's final letter. Querida Isabelle, I have lived my entire life believing I was protecting my family by keeping silent about the coins and their meaning. But silence is not protection. It is selfishness disguised as caution. I am dying, and I cannot take these secrets with me. Al is a good man, but he is not ready for this burden. His children, however Luna and Diagothe, have the hearts we need for this work. I am hiding this letter with the coins, trusting that when they are old enough to understand, they will find you and complete what our grandfathers began. The locket Al carries is only half of the key. You have the other half. Together, they reveal the location of the master cachino, just our family's collection, but the central repository where the most precious items from dozens of families were hidden. It was never about the money, Isabelle. It was about proving that promises can be kept across generations, that love is stronger than war, and that strangers can become family when they share sacred responsibilities. Trust the children to understand what we could not. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath as the implications settled. There wasn't just one cache of treasures there, was a master repository that contained items from dozens of families, hidden somewhere that could only be located by combining both lockets. Where is it? Diego asked, his practical mind immediately focused on the next step. Isabelle smiled, producing the interlocking key that their combined lockets had revealed, 20 kilometers outside Barcelona, in a cave system that my father and yours explored as boys. But accessing it requires more than just finding the location. It requires choosing what to do with what we find there. Al looked at his children, understanding finally that their journey had been guided not by chance, but by careful planning that spanned 3 generations. Elena had orchestrated their discovery of the coins, knowing that her grandchildren would have the courage to follow the trail to its conclusion. His great-grandfather and Isabelle's father had preserved not just individual family treasures, but a collection that represented the hopes and losses of an entire community. "How many families?" Al asked. 47, Isabelle replied without hesitation. 47 families whose treasures were entrusted to our grandfathers. Some of the families survived and scattered across the world. Others perished completely, but all of them trusted that someday someone would remember their stories and honor their losses. Luna had been studying the combined lockets, her young mind processing complexities that adults had struggled with for decades. "Isabelle, what happens if we find all the treasures but can't find all the families?" "Then we must decide who we become," Isabelle replied, her eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had spent 8 decades thinking about this question. "Do we become the generation that finally fulfills our grandfather's promises? Or do we become the generation that finds another way to honor what was lost?" That evening, back in their hotel room, Al sat with his children and Isabelle's revelations, understanding that everything they had discovered up to this point had been preparation for a choice that would define not just their family's future, but their understanding of what family meant. They weren't just returning lost treasures to scattered descendants, they were deciding how to heal wounds that had been carried across continents and generations. The master cache represented not just material wealth, but the accumulated grief and hope of people who had trusted strangers to remember them. "Tomorrow we go to the cave," Al said, pulling Luna and Diego close. "And we find out what our grandfathers really preserved for us." Outside their window, Barcelona's lights stretched toward the Mediterranean, connecting Spain to a world where the descendants of Civil War refugees had built new lives without forgetting old losses. Somewhere among those lights lived families who might wake tomorrow to discover that promises made in desperate times were finally being fulfilled by people they had never met, but who had become, through the mystery of shared responsibility, family. The combined lockets lay on the bedside table, their hidden key revealed, pointing toward a discovery that would test everything Al had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of inheritance. Elena's final letter had been clear. The children would understand what the adults could not. Tomorrow would reveal whether that faith had been justified. The drive through the Catalonian countryside began before dawn, Isabelle's careful directions guiding them through small villages that seemed untouched by time. Al had rented a car large enough to accommodate Isabelle, whose presence had become essential not just for navigation, but for the emotional weight she carried as the last direct connection to their grandfather's pact. Dr. Herrera and Miguel Santos from the Salamanca Community Center had joined them, understanding that what they were about to discover would require witnesses and expertise beyond what the Cruz family could provide alone. The legal implications of finding a master cache were complex, involving Spanish heritage laws, international restitution protocols, and the rights of families scattered across multiple countries. The cave system is called Cova dels Tres Germans Cave of the Three Brothers, Isabelle explained as they turned onto a narrow mountain road. "My father and yours discovered it as boys, along with their older brother who died in the first months of the war. They always said it felt like a sacred place, somewhere that could keep secrets safely." Diego had spread detailed topographical maps across his lap, cross-referencing Isabelle's directions with the coordinates from the lockets. His systematic approach to complex problems had evolved throughout their journey, and Al marveled at watching his 12-year-old son coordinate logistics that would challenge many adults. Luna, meanwhile, had been unusually quiet during the drive, holding Rosa's wooden cross and seeming to prepare herself emotionally for whatever they might find. Her intuitive understanding of the human elements in their story had been crucial throughout their journey, and Al sensed she was processing implications that the rest of them hadn't yet considered. "What if some of the families don't want their treasures back?" Luna asked suddenly, her question cutting to the heart of complexities they hadn't fully discussed. What if getting them back makes them sadder than not having them? It was a profound question that reflected understanding beyond her years. Isabelle reached across to squeeze Luna's hand, recognizing wisdom that had taken her 8 decades to develop. "Then we trust them to tell us what would heal them most," Isabelle replied. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do with a memory is to transform it into something that helps others." The cave entrance was hidden behind a natural rock formation that would have been impossible to find without specific directions. As they approached on foot, carrying flashlights and the specialized equipment that Dr. Herrera had assembled, Al felt the weight of history pressing down like the mountain above them. "Our grandfathers chose this place because it was already ancient when they found it," Isabelle explained, using the locket key to unlock a metal box concealed behind loose stones. "They believed that some places hold memory better than others, that the earth itself could be trusted with sacred responsibilities." Inside the metal box was a detailed map of the cave system and careful instructions written in both his great-grandfather's and Isabelle's father's handwriting. The two men had clearly spent months preparing this repository, creating multiple safeguards and contingencies to ensure their treasures would be preserved, even if one of them didn't survive the war. The cave extended deeper into the mountain than Al had expected, its passages carved by underground streams that had been diverted decades ago to create dry storage areas. Their flashlights revealed careful stonework where the two brothers had reinforced natural chambers and created sealed storage areas designed to protect their contents from time and moisture. "There," Isabelle breathed, pointing toward a chamber where their flashlight beams revealed stacks of wooden crates, metal containers, and carefully wrapped bundles that had been waiting in darkness for 87 years. The first crate they opened contained items that were clearly personal rather than valuable photographs, letters, children's drawings, and small religious objects that represented faith and memory rather than material wealth. But it was the inventory book, written in meticulous detail by both brothers, that revealed the true scope of what they had preserved. 47 families, Dr. Herrera read aloud, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. Religious artifacts, family jewelry, photographs, documents, and yes, multiple collections of gold coins from different regions and periods. Miguel Santos was documenting everything with the careful attention of someone who understood they were witnessing a historic discovery. "This isn't just a family treasure cache," he said with growing excitement. "This is one of the most significant collections of Spanish Civil War civilian artifacts ever found. The historical and cultural value is immeasurable. But it was Diego who made the discovery that would define everything that followed." In a sealed container marked "Para las futuras generaciones." For future generations, she found a letter written jointly by their great-grandfather and Isabel's father, dated December 1940, and addressed to "the children and grandchildren who will complete our work." Al read the letter aloud, while the others listened in the cathedral-like silence of the cave. "To our descendants who have found this place, we write this knowing we may not survive to see our promises fulfilled, but trusting that love and responsibility pass from generation to generation like inherited blessings. What you have found here was never meant to be kept or sold. It was meant to be returned, but if you cannot find all the families, you must decide how to honor what they lost. We suggest that some treasures return to families, but others might serve better by helping places that care for people who have no families left. The orphanages, the community centers, the places where strangers become family, these might be the most sacred recipients of all. Trust your hearts to know the difference between keeping promises and making them new. Signed with love and hope, Francisco Cruz and Miguel Moreno. The silence that followed was broken by Luna's whisper. They knew we would find each other. They knew we would know what to do. Isabelle nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. They planned for this exact moment, these exact choices. They trusted us to be wise enough to understand that healing doesn't always mean returning what was lost. Sometimes it means transforming loss into hope. The afternoon was spent cataloging and documenting the complete contents of the repository. Dr. Herrera's expertise proved crucial, as they identified artifacts that belonged to families they had already contacted, items that matched entries in the journals, and treasures that would require additional research to connect with their rightful heirs. But the most significant discovery came as they prepared to leave. In the deepest chamber of the cave, Miguel Santos found a final container that contained not family treasures, but something even more preciosa. Complete record of the informal network that had operated throughout Spain during and after the war, preserving not just objects but stories, connections, and hope itself. This is a directory of everyone who participated in the preservation efforts, Miguel announced, his voice filled with awe. Hundreds of names, addresses, contact network sits, a complete map of how ordinary people became heroes during the war's worst moments. The drive back to Barcelona was quiet, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had discovered and the decisions that lay ahead. The repository contained enough treasure to ensure financial security for the Cruz family and dozens of others. But more importantly, it contained the tools necessary to heal wounds that had been carried across generations. That evening, in Isabelle's small apartment, they spread out the complete inventory and began the work of creating what Isabelle called the Community Trust Charter, a legal document that would establish how the treasures would be distributed to honor both individual families and the collective good. Some items must go back to families, Al said, studying photographs and personal artifacts that were clearly irreplaceable to their original owners. Rosa's grandmother's crucifix, Carmen's grandfather's watch, the Marino family Bible. But others, Luna added, her voice carrying the certainty that had characterized her insights throughout their journey, should help places like the community center in Salamanca, places that take care of people who need families. Diego had been working on calculations, his systematic mind trying to balance justice with practicality. If we sell some of the coins to fund the community programs and return the personal items to families and keep enough to secure our own future without being greedy, that seems like what great-grandfather and Isabelle's father intended. Isabelle smiled at the children's natural wisdom. You understand something that took me decades to learn. True inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you choose to do with what you've been given. The legal work began immediately. Dr. W. Herrera contacted Spanish authorities to ensure proper documentation of the discovery, while Miguel Santos reached out to the network of community organizations that would benefit from the trust fund they were establishing. The process would take months to complete, but the framework was clear. Individual families would receive their personal treasures, community organizations would receive funding to continue their work, and the Cruz family would secure their future without forgetting their responsibilities. There's one more thing, Isabelle said as the evening drew late. She produced a sealed envelope that had been hidden in her apartment for decades. Your grandmother Elena asked me to give this to you only after you had seen the repository and made your choices. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper in Elena's handwriting. Mi querido Al, if you are reading this, then the children have led you to understand what I could never explain. They have the hearts necessary for this work because they inherited them from you, and you inherited yours from me, and I inherited mine from my father, who believed that love is stronger than loss. I am proud of the family we became, and I am proud of the family you will choose to help create. Con amor siempre, Mama. Al looked around the small apartment where Isabelle had waited 89 years to complete a promise made in her childhood, where his children had grown into the roles Elena had envisioned for them, where strangers had become family through shared sacred responsibility. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the most important work contacting families, establishing the trust fund and transforming a collection of buried treasures into a living bridge between past and present. The community center in Salamanca would be saved. Rosa would receive her grandmother's crucifix, and dozens of other families would discover that promises made in desperate times had been honored by people they had never met, but who had become, through choice and commitment, their family. The real treasure had never been the gold coins. It had been the opportunity to prove that love could be inherited, that responsibility could be shared across generations, and that healing was possible even for wounds that had been carried for almost a century. 6 months later, the community center in Salamanca had been transformed into something that looked like a celebration and felt like a homecoming. Representatives from 47 families had gathered from across Spain, Mexico, Argentina, and beyond, drawn by news that had spread through refugee descendant networks like wildfire. The promises were finally being kept. Al stood at the entrance of the center, greeting families whose names he had memorized from his great-grandfather's careful journals. Rosa Martinez had come from Madrid, carrying a small suitcase for the golden crucifix that would finally return to her family after 87 years. Carmen Delgado had flown in from Mexico with 3 generations of her family, all eager to see their grandfather's watch that had been preserved against impossible odds. The original cedar strongbox sat in a place of honor at the center of the main hall, no longer hiding secrets, but serving as the ceremonial container for the trust documents that would ensure the community center's survival and expansion. Luna and Diego had insisted that the box be repurposed this way, understanding intuitively that symbols matter as much as substance when healing old wounds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Al began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the confidence he had developed over months of learning to speak about things larger than himself. "We are here today not just to return what was lost, but to complete what was begun by people who believed that love could be stronger than war, that memory could be stronger than loss." Isabelle sat in the front row, her 89-year-old frame wrapped in a shawl that had belonged to her mother, her eyes bright with satisfaction that had been decades in the making. Beside her, Dr. Herrera and Miguel Santos represented the scholarly and community networks that had made this gathering possible. Diego stepped forward with the careful formality he had developed for important occasions, carrying a leather portfolio containing the trust documents that would govern the distribution of the recovered treasures. His 12-year-old seriousness had impressed the lawyers and government officials who had spent months working out the legal complexities of international restitution. "The Francisco Cruz and Miguel Moreno Memorial Trust," Diego announced, "has been established to ensure that personal treasures return to their families and that the financial resources support community organizations that care for people who need families." Luna moved to stand beside the cedar strongbox, her role in the ceremony reflecting her unique ability to understand the emotional heart of their mission. In her hands, she carried the first item to be formally returned, Rosa's grandmother's golden crucifix, which had been cleaned and restored to its original beauty. "Señora Martinez," Luna said, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "your grandmother's crucifix has been waiting for you. She believed it would protect your family, and maybe it did, maybe it protected your family's hope until this day came." Rosa approached with tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she received the crucifix that had been blessed in her grandmother's parish church before the war began. The moment of connection between past and present, between loss and recovery, between strangers who had become family through shared sacred responsibility, resonated through the hall like a blessing. One by one, families received the personal treasures that had been preserved in the cave. Carmen's grandfather's watch, still ticking after decades of careful preservation. A child's silver christening cup that had been hidden by parents who died before they could reclaim it. Family photographs that had been saved by strangers who understood that memory was more precious than material wealth. But it was the announcement of the trust fund's broader impact that brought the ceremony to its emotional climax. Miguel Santos stepped forward to read the list of community organizations that would receive funding: orphanages in Argentina that served the descendants of Spanish refugees, cultural centers in Mexico that preserved Republican heritage, and community programs throughout Spain that continued the work of caring for people who needed families. The Santa Teresa Community Center here in Salamanca, Miguel announced, will receive enough funding to continue operating for the next 20 years, serving the neighborhood where the original orphanage once stood. In addition, we will establish a scholarship program for the children of refugee families, ensuring that education, the one treasure that can never be stolen, remains accessible to those who need it most. Al felt the weight of completion settling over him like peace. This was what Elena had envisioned, what his great-grandfather and Isabelle's father had planned for, across decades of patience and hope. The gold coins had been transformed from buried treasure into living support for communities that carried on the work of healing wounds that war had opened. The ceremony continued with presentations about the historical significance of the discovery, academic papers that would preserve the stories for future researchers, and plans for additional research into other potential repositories that might still be waiting to be found. But it was Luna who provided the moment that would be remembered long after the formal presentations were forgotten. As the afternoon light slanted through the community center's windows, she stood beside the memorial plaque that had been installed to honor the original orphanage and spoke with the simple directness that had characterized her understanding throughout their journey. Today we learned that promises can be kept even when the people who made them are gone, she said, her young voice carrying the wisdom that had guided their family's choices. We learned that treasures are supposed to be shared, not kept. And we learned that when you help heal someone else's family, you heal your own family too. The applause that followed felt like gratitude made audible, a sound that connected everyone present to the understanding that they had witnessed something rare, the completion of a story that proved love could indeed be stronger than loss, that memory could survive even the worst that history could inflict, and that ordinary people could become heroes simply by choosing to honor the trust placed in them by strangers. As the formal ceremony concluded and individual families began the private process of reconnecting with their recovered heritage, Al found himself standing in the garden where the original orphanage. As the formal ceremony concluded and individual families began the private process of reconnecting with their recovered heritage, Al found himself standing in the garden where the original orphanage cornerstone had been preserved. Luna and Diego were helping elderly relatives examine photographs and documents, their natural empathy, creating bridges between past and present that seemed to heal wounds simply through their existence. "Señor Cruz," a voice called softly behind him. Al turned to find a young woman in her 30s, holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "My name is Elena Vega. I believe you have been looking for my family." The name struck Al like recognition made physical. "You're Isabelle Moreno's granddaughter." Elena nodded, her eyes holding the same brightness that had characterized Isabelle's gaze. "My grandmother Isabelle Moreno de Vega died 3 months ago, but she told me everything before she passed. She said that when the Cruz family found their way to Spain, I should be here to represent our family's gratitude." The small boy looked up at Al with curiosity unclouded by the weight of history that his mother carried. "Mama says you found treasures that belonged to our family from a long time ago." "We did," Al replied, kneeling to meet the child at eye level. "Your great-great-grandmother Isabelle was very brave during a difficult time, and she trusted my great-grandfather to keep something safe for your family." Elena produced a small wrapped package. "Before my grandmother died, she asked me to give this to Luna. She said it was for the little girl who had the courage to ask the right questions." Luna appeared at Al's elbow with the timing that had become characteristic of their shared journey. When she unwrapped Elena's gift, she found a small silver bracelet with tiny charms that represented different stages of a life well lived: a house, a book, a child's shoe, a wedding ring. "Isabelle wore this every day," Elena explained. "She added a charm for each important moment in her life. The last charm she added was a small key for the day when the Cruz family found her and completed the promise their great-grandfather had made." The afternoon stretched into evening as individual families shared stories, examined recovered treasures, and began the process of integrating these recovered pieces of their past into their present understanding of who they were. The community center buzzed with conversations in Spanish, Catalan, and the careful English of families who had scattered across continents but maintained connection through shared memory. Carmen Delgado's reunion with her grandfather's watch became the focal point for a larger gathering of families who had lost relatives during the war. The watch still kept perfect time. Its inscription, "Para mi querida Rosa," con amor eterno, speaking across decades to prove that love had indeed been eternal, preserved through the dedication of strangers who became family through choice. The watch was never about time, Carmen said, holding the timepiece while her own grandchildren gathered around to hear the story. It was about the promise that someday, somehow, our family's story would be completed. Diego had positioned himself near the document table, helping families understand the legal aspects of the trust fund and answering questions about how the ongoing distributions would work. His systematic approach to complex problems had evolved into something approaching expertise, and Al watched with pride as his son explained inheritance law to adults 3 times his age. "The trust is designed to be permanent," Diego explained to a group of family representatives. "It will continue supporting community organizations and educational programs, even after all the personal treasures have been returned. The idea is that healing should be ongoing, not just a one-time event." But it was Luna's interaction with the youngest members of the gathered families that provided the emotional center for the extended celebration. She had organized an impromptu garden planting ceremony, working with children to plant seeds that had been collected from locations across Spina, living memorial that would grow and change while maintaining connection to the past. "These seeds came from gardens that survived the war," Luna explained to a group of children ranging in age from 6 to 16. "When they grow into flowers and trees, they'll be like the promises that waited so long to be kept, beautiful things that came from difficult times." The garden plot they were creating occupied the exact location where the original orphanage's garden had once provided food and beauty for children who had lost everything else. The symbolism wasn't lost on the adults who watched their children and grandchildren work together, creating something new from soil that had been watered by both tears and hope. Miguel Santos approached Al as the sun began to set behind Salamanca's ancient buildings. "There's been a development you should know about," he said quietly. "The story of your family's discovery has reached other refugee communities. We've received inquiries from organizations in France, Argentina, and Mexico about similar preservation networks that might have operated in their regions." Al felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The completion of his great-grandfather's mission had been overwhelming enough. The possibility that their story might inspire similar discoveries elsewhere was both thrilling and daunting. "What kind of inquiries?" "Families who have stories similar to yours grandparents, who spoke of treasures left behind, promises made by strangers, informal networks that preserved what they could during wartime. Your family's success has given them hope that their own interrupted stories might find completion." As the evening drew toward its close, Isabelle's great-granddaughter Elena approached Al with a proposal that would extend their mission far beyond what any of them had originally imagined. "The families here tonight have been talking," Elena said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent months thinking about possibilities. "We want to establish a permanent foundation, the Cruz Moreno Foundation for Interrupted Stories. Its mission would be to help other families and communities find and complete promises that were broken by war, displacement, or other historical traumas." The idea resonated with everything Al had learned about the power of shared responsibility and the way individual healing could become collective transformation. But it also represented a commitment that would extend far beyond the original scope of returning his great-grandfather's cash. It would mean ongoing work, Elena continued. Research, legal coordination, fundraising, community outreach. It would mean that your family's story becomes part of something even larger. Al looked across the garden where Luna and Diego were helping children water the newly planted seeds, their faces bright with the satisfaction of work that felt meaningful. He thought about Elena's careful planning, about the trust that had been placed in them by families they had never met, about the choice between keeping promises and making them new. "We'll need to talk about it as a family," Al said finally. "But I think my children already know what the answer will be." The evening concluded with a moment of silence for all the families whose stories had been interrupted by war and loss, followed by a commitment ceremony where each family representative pledged to maintain connection with the others and to support the ongoing work of healing historical wounds. As they prepared to leave the community center, Al carried with him the cedar strongbox that had started their journey now, empty of secrets but full of documents that established the trust fund, contact information for 47 families who had become extended relatives, and plans for work that would continue long after their return to America. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished and the even greater magnitude of what they had committed to continue. The original mission had been completed, but completion had revealed new missions, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed be stronger than loss. "Papa," Luna said sleepily from the back seat, "I think great-grandfather and Isabelle's father would be proud of us." "I think they are proud of us," Al replied, understanding finally that the presence he had felt throughout their journey hadn't been memory or imagination, but the ongoing reality of love that transcends time, connection that survives separation, and hope that grows stronger when it's shared rather than hoarded. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of their journey home to America, but they were returning as different people than those who had left. They were returning as guardians of ongoing promises, as members of an extended family that spanned continents and generations, as proof that ordinary people could indeed become heroes, simply by choosing to honor the trust placed in them by strangers who had become family through shared sacred responsibility. 2 years later, Al stood in the same spot in his grandmother's garden where Luna and Diego had first unearthed the cedar strongbox, but everything had changed. The fig tree still dominated the center of the yard, its branches fuller now and heavy with fruit that they shared with neighbors who had become extended family through proximity and affection. The garden itself had been transformed into something that Elena would have recognized but never could have imagined, living memorial that connected their small suburban backyard to communities across 3 continents. The mortgage had been paid off 18 months ago. The house renovated with care that preserved its character while making it suitable for the work it now supported. The spare bedroom had been converted into an office for the Cruz Marino Foundation for Interrupted Stories, where Diego, now 14 and possessed of an organizational sophistication that impressed visiting academics, coordinated research requests from families across the globe. Luna, 11 years old and more empathetic than ever, had developed a specialty in working with the youngest members of families who were searching for lost pieces of their heritage. Her memory book, a scrapbook that had started as a simple collection of photographs from their Spanish journey, had evolved into a comprehensive archive of every family they had helped reconnect with their interrupted stories. "Papa, the Santos family from Chile found their grandfather's violin," Luna announced, entering the garden where Al was tending the new plantings that had arrived from Spain just the week before. "The violin was in a collection in Buenos Aires, and they're going to have a concert to celebrate getting it back." Al smiled, setting down his watering can to give Luna his full attention. Each success story still filled him with the mixture of joy and amazement that had characterized their work since returning from Spain. The foundation had helped locate treasures for 38 families in its first 2 years of operation, but more importantly, it had created a network of people who understood that healing historical wounds required ongoing commitment rather than single gestures. "That's wonderful, Mija. Did they say if they'll contribute to the scholarship fund?" "They're donating the proceeds from the concert," Luna replied, consulting the small notebook where she tracked the foundation's expanding network of supporters. "And the Mexican families we helped last month are organizing a benefit dinner in Guadalajara." The scholarship fund had become one of the foundation's most important initiatives, providing educational support for the children and grandchildren of refugee families. Diego had proposed the program, after realizing that many of the families they were helping faced the same financial pressures that had once threatened the Cruz family's stability. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the garden gate, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. At 80, she moved more slowly than she had when the children first discovered the strongbox, but her enthusiasm for their work had never diminished. "Al, dear, you have visitors," she announced. "There's a young man from the university who says he's been corresponding with Diego about some documents they found in France." Diego emerged from the house, his summer tan and increased height, making him look older than his 14 years. He had developed the habit of greeting visiting researchers with the same formal courtesy that had impressed Spanish officials during their original journey. "This is Professor Martin from UC Berkeley," Diego said, introducing a man in his 30s who carried the leather satchel and eager expression characteristic of academics who had stumbled onto discoveries that excited them. "He's been researching French resistance networks that helped Spanish refugees during World War II. Professor Martin settled into one of the garden chairs that had become standard equipment for the informal conferences that regularly took place beneath Elena's fig tree. "Your foundation's database has been invaluable for my research," he began, "but I think I've found something that might be valuable for your work as well." He produced a collection of documents that looked remarkably similar to the journals Al's great-grandfather had kept careful handwriting in multiple languages, pressed flowers, sketches of locations, and lists of names and addresses. These belonged to a French resistance member who operated along the Spanish border from 1940 to 1944, Professor Martin explained. She helped Spanish refugees cross into France and documented the personal items they carried. Many of these families were later relocated to North Africa or South America, but she kept records of everything they had entrusted to her care. Al felt the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that had come to characterize moments when their work expanded into new territories. Each discovery brought opportunities to heal additional wounds, but also increased the complexity of their mission. "How many families?" Luna asked, her practical approach to emotional complexity demonstrating how much she had learned about managing hope and realistic expectations. "Approximately 60, Professor Martin replied. "And here's what makes it especially interesting. Some of these families appear in your Spanish records as well. There might be families who entrusted items to preservation networks in both Spain and France, creating multiple threads of interrupted stories that could be woven back together." Diego was already taking notes, his systematic mind automatically organizing the implications and next steps. "Do you have any information about whether the French woman actually preserved the items or just documented them?" "That's where your family's expertise would be invaluable," Professor Martin said. "The documents contain the same kind of coded references and map fragments that you encountered in Spain. I think there might be additional repositories waiting to be discovered." The afternoon stretched into evening as they discussed the possibilities and challenges of expanding their work into France. The Foundation had developed protocols for international collaboration, legal frameworks for cross-border restitution, and relationships with refugee descendant organizations throughout Europe and the Americas. But each new territory brought unique complications and required careful navigation of historical sensitivities. "There's something else," Professor Martin said as the conversation began to wind down. "I've been contacted by researchers in Poland, Greece, and Italy who have found similar documentation networks. Your family's success in Spain has inspired people to look more carefully at preservation efforts that operated throughout Europe during the war years." Al looked around the garden where 2 years of careful tending had created a space that felt both intimate and international. Seeds and cuttings from Spain had taken root alongside plantings from Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, creating a living map of the families they had helped reconnect with their heritage. "Professor," Al said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like it could become a lifetime's work." "It could," Professor Martin agreed, "but it could also become the most significant historical healing project of our generation." The network of people who preserved cultural heritage during wartime was far more extensive than we previously understood. Your family proved that these preservation efforts worked, that promises made in desperate times could be honored across generations. As Professor Martin prepared to leave, he handed Luna a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "This came from the French documents," he explained. "It's a child's drawing that was preserved along with other family items. I thought you might like to see it." The drawing was simple but powerful: a house with flowers in the garden, a family of stick figures holding hands, and the words, "Pour quand nous rentrerons à la maison," written in a child's careful handwriting. "For when we return home," Luna translated, her facility with languages having expanded significantly since their Spanish journey. Someone drew a picture of the home they hoped to return to someday. "Exactly," Professor Martin said, "and maybe, with your foundation's help, that child's descendants will finally be able to return home in the ways that matter most through recovered memory, restored connection, and healed wounds." That evening, as Al tucked his children into beds that now sat in rooms where the walls held photographs from Spain, letters from families they had helped, and maps marking the locations of ongoing foundation projects, he reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by Luna's shovel hitting something hard beneath Elena's fig tree. "Papa," Diego said from his bed, where he was reading correspondence from families in Argentina who were searching for artifacts that might have been preserved in Spanish networks. "Do you think we'll ever finish this work?" "I don't think we're supposed to finish it," Al replied, settling into the chair that had become his spot for evening conversations with his children. "I think we're supposed to do it well enough that other people can continue it after us." Luna had been quiet, studying the French child's drawing by lamplight. The little person who drew this probably grew up and had children and grandchildren. Maybe they told stories about the home they left behind, about the things they had to leave behind. "Maybe they did," Al agreed. "Then maybe someday we'll help them find their way back to the things that were saved for them. Not the same house, but the same love that made the house feel like home." Al turned off the lights and returned to the garden, where he often spent quiet moments processing the weight of their ongoing responsibilities. The foundation now employed 3 part-time researchers, maintained relationships with historical societies in 12 countries, and had helped establish similar organizations in Mexico and Argentina. The work had grown beyond anything Elena could have envisioned when she buried her letter with the gold coins. The fig tree's branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, heavy with fruit that would ripen in the coming weeks. Mrs. Henderson had already asked for permission to preserve some of the figs in jars that would be shared with foundation supporters across the community. Tradition that seemed to honor Elena's memory while creating new connections between past and present. Al's phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen Delgado in Mexico, who now served on the foundation's advisory board. "The watch keeps perfect time," she wrote, as she did every month on the anniversary of their Spanish ceremony. "Just like promises that are kept." Looking up at the stars that connected his suburban garden to the Spanish cave, where his great-grandfather's treasures had waited for almost 9 decades, Al felt the presence of Elena and all the families whose stories had been interrupted by war, but completed by love. The gold coins had been transformed into educational scholarships, community support, and ongoing hope. The cedar strongbox sat in a place of honor in their home office, now holding not secrets, but the documents that established the Foundation's mission and the correspondence that proved healing was possible, even for wounds that had been carried across continents and generations. Tomorrow would bring new requests for help, new families searching for lost pieces of their heritage, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed be stronger than loss. But tonight, surrounded by plants that carried soil from 3 continents, and filled with gratitude for children who had inherited courage, along with curiosity, Al understood finally that the greatest treasure they had unearthed wasn't buried gold, it was the discovery that ordinary people could become heroes simply by choosing to honor the trust placed in them by strangers who became family, through shared, sacred responsibility. The fig tree stood sentinel over their transformed garden, its roots no longer holding secrets, but its branches still offering shade and shelter to anyone who understood that the most valuable inheritances aren't material treasures, but the opportunity to heal wounds, keep promises, and prove that memory, when handled with love, becomes hope.